Following World War II, the alliance between the USA and the USSR began to shatter as the two powers emerged as global superpowers. The ideological divide, capitalism and democracy versus communism, set the stage for a prolonged period of tension known as the Cold War. The rivalry between the USA and the USSR during the Cold War is well documented. However, communists ruled Russia for almost 30 years before its onset. During this time, how did both nations feel about each other? Did the Soviet Union and the United States always hate one another? Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the USA and the Russian Empire had a remarkably positive relationship. This dynamic shifted dramatically after the Russian Revolution, as Woodrow Wilson was not pleased with the new communist government. When the Russian Revolution overthrew the Tsarist regime, the U.S. was concerned that its old friend would fall apart after the war. Wilson attempted to provide support to both sides of the Russian Civil War at the Paris Peace Conference, but this proved futile. The opposing white forces had little authority, while the Bolsheviks dismissed the negotiations as imperialist and illegitimate. Once the Russian Civil War concluded in 1922, the U.S. did not wish to get involved directly, but was apprehensive about Japanese ambitions in Siberia, leading to American troop deployments that worsened relations with Russia. American investors had lost significant money when the Bolshevik government nationalized their assets and rejected any repayment of foreign debts, straining diplomatic relations further. By the 1930s, however, most Western European countries had recognized the Soviet regime, prompting the United States to negotiate official recognition in 1933. In return for U.S. recognition of Stalin's government, the USSR promised increased trade and the preservation of American religious freedoms. This deal was seen as beneficial for the U.S., despite the Soviet government's insincerity regarding these promises. In 1946, Winston Churchill famously declared that an iron curtain had descended across Europe, symbolizing the growing divide that would define U.S. Soviet relations. This metaphor encapsulated the feelings of hostility that soon permeated both societies. Both nations engaged in extensive propaganda campaigns to depict each other negatively. The United States portrayed the USSR as a totalitarian regime threatening freedom, while the Soviet Union criticized American society for its materialism and racism. Relations remained poor until the German invasion of the USSR in 1941, after which the U.S. provided material aid to the Soviets to support the war effort. While the U.S. government aimed to crush Germany, concern about Soviet dominance in Europe following the war lingered. The hope for many was that the war would diminish the USSR's influence, but this did not materialize, further exacerbating U.S.-Soviet relations. The 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis was perhaps the most significant event that demonstrated the intense friction between the two nations. The confrontation brought them perilously close to nuclear war, leading to heightened fears and animosity. The espionage activities between the nations culminated in an arms race that created an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and hostility. The environment was not merely a political rivalry, but also reflected deep-seated fears regarding national security on both sides. Despite the prevailing hostilities, periods of détente emerged. Notable moments include the signing of arms reduction treaties such as SALT-I, demonstrating a recognition of the necessity for coexistence and the avoidance of mutual annihilation. Leaders like Richard Nixon and Nikita Khrushchev engaged in diplomatic dialogues that, while fraught with tension, revealed a recognition of the need for negotiation over outright conflict. Throughout the Cold War, public perception of the USSR shifted. Cultural exchanges reflected that while institutional hatred existed, personal engagements often revealed a more complex relationship between ordinary citizens. Interviews with historians and cultural commentators highlight that hostility was often manufactured by leaders for political gain. People-to-people interactions showed that fear and hatred were not universally felt, complicating the narrative of widespread animosity between the two nations. And while there were periods of genuine hostility, particularly during critical moments like the Cuban Missile Crisis, much of the perceived hatred between the USA and the USSR resulted from politically constructed narratives. The rivalry was fueled more by ideological differences and political maneuvering than by ill will at a personal level. The complexities of U.S.-Soviet relations leave a legacy that continues to inform international relations today. Understanding that political agendas often manipulate public sentiment is crucial as we study geopolitical tensions in modern contexts. By examining the Cold War's roots, we can better understand contemporary global affairs and the persisting echoes of past rivalries. If you found this helpful, consider subscribing to be notified on future videos.